Oh my God, guys. I am so sorry. It is so hot in here. I also have so much hair and this big light on me, and I'm just, okay. I'm being dramatic, but the shirt is coming off, so. Okay, locking back in. Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. I hope you're happy, healthy, and absolutely thriving. My name is Mychala. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. Please stick around and subscribe. And if you have been here for a while, hello, it's good to see you again. October was one of, if not the best reading month I've had in all of 2025 so far. Not just because of the quantity of books that I read, but because of the impact that these books have left on me. I read 8 books in October, 3 of which were 5 stars. One I rated 4.75, one I rated 4.5, one I rated 3.75, one was rated 3, and one was rated 2.75. 3 5-star books in 1 month and 2 books that were really close to being 5 stars. This was a successful reading month for me, so let's get into it. First, I read Girl Wash Your Face by Rachel Hollis. I ended up rating this 3.75 stars. This is less of an actionable self-help book and more of a motivational speech meets memoir. That's not to say it's a bad thing at all. I really personally enjoy memoirs. You manage your expectations if you're going into this expecting a clear how-to on how to heal parts of yourself or fix certain aspects of your life. When I first finished this, I rated it 4.25 stars. I remember feeling so fired up. However, I haven't thought about this book since the day that I finished it. I think that feeling I had at the end of this book had mostly to do with Rachel Hollis's narration of it. I did listen to it on audiobook, and it leans very heavily into the realm of motivational speaking, where she evokes super strong emotions in readers that gives them a momentary high, but then it all fades quickly because it's not a lot of actionable advice. I do think this book works really well as an audiobook, especially if you need a little emotional pick-me-up. If you already know what works for you and how to dig yourself out of the trenches, you just need someone to kind of kick you in the butt and reiterate the ideologies that you already are aware of. However, if you are someone who is struggling deeply with something, this might not be the book that you're looking for. Rachel Hollis very briefly acknowledges her privilege as a well-off white woman, but much of the language still feels like it originates from a place of entitlement. That underlying tone is extremely hard to shed if someone hasn't fully recognized the upper hand that they have in the world. There were times where she could be saying something extremely encouraging, but it sounds like if you're depressed, just smile. If you're poor, just go make money. At times, it did feel a little tone deaf and a little blind to the heavy stressors and oppressions that people face. It was just so blatantly obvious that our identities and experiences are vastly different. I could really feel that divide. And in my opinion, a really good self-help book or memoir feels like the author wrote it for everyone. I could feel that this book wasn't written with people like me in mind. All that being said, I would still recommend this for someone who might just want to be gassed up a little, who might need some positive affirmations spoken to them. It is a very light and positive and encouraging message. If you are going to read it, I definitely suggest listening to it on audiobook so it feels basically like a really long motivational speech. Next, I read I Want to Die, But I Want to Eat Tteokpokki by Se-hee. I read this 2 weeks, sadly, before the passing of this author. This is basically a transcriptions of the author's therapy sessions as she navigates life with depression. To be completely honest, I didn't rate it very highly, mostly because the structure felt very uninspired and ineffective. It is almost solely a word-for-word dialogue between Se-hee and her therapist, which it just ended up feeling more detached than if we had gotten her personal musings after the therapy sessions. I also had problems with some of the advice that the therapist gave, most of which weren't really addressed. But ultimately, I really respect Se-hee's bravery and willingness to share such a tender and personal part of her life. And then I read When Breath Becomes Air by Kalanithi. This was my first 5-star of October. This is another nonfiction / memoir. I was really into nonfiction and memoirs this month, chronicling the author's life after his terminal cancer diagnosis. Paul was in his last year of residency, dedicating his entire adult life to neurosurgery. As you can imagine, getting this diagnosis flipped his world on its axis. And as someone who struggles deeply journey and grapples with death and dying, this book called me out and called me higher. Paul's journey was so eye-opening to the realities of illness and dying. It was heartbreakingly beautiful to witness his experience as he's forced to go from doctor and healer to patient seeking healing. I imagine that is a challenge to the ego and one's sense of humanity. And I don't use the term ego to call him prideful at all. I just mean it was very interesting to watch how he grappled with that forceful and sudden shift in his identity. On a technical level, this book was extremely well written. It was structured perfectly, easy to follow, and highly engaging. It wasn't bogged down by medical terms and processes, but instead it focused more on Paul's inner and outward journey through the illness. As a doctor himself, he could have easily intellectualized his experience and taken a much more scientific approach to the storytelling, but I appreciate that he leaned into the emotional and mental struggles. Reading about Paul's life was very reminiscent of reading about Maury Schwartz from Tuesdays with Maury, which is strange because Maury and Paul have very little in common. Paul was in his 30s when he was diagnosed with cancer, and Maury was 78 when he was diagnosed with ALS. Maury passed in 1995 and Paul passed 20 years later in 2015. Paul was a neurosurgeon and Maury was a sociology professor. In the end, they had very, very similar musings and insights on their own lives and deaths. It's sadly poetic, but in my opinion, very beautiful that I'm able to draw these parallels between two people who didn't ever know each other, but still had very similar endings to their lives. And then I read another 5-star book, which is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Listening to Maya Angelou's story through her voice was a spectacular reading experience. It was truly remarkable to hear the emotion and inflection behind her voice as she recounts the events of her early life. I loved listening to the circumstances and upbringing that made her her. Much of her life is tragic and sad as she grew up in a time in a place where violent racism and oppression and poverty flourished. Hearing about some of the atrocities that she faced was so heartbreaking. However, Maya has a way of recounting her past in the same matter-of-fact, lightweight tone that an innocent child would. You know when a child comes up to you and they say something absolutely diabolical in the most chill, nonchalant way? My parents are divorcing, and you're just kind of flabbergasted and you feel awful, but also something about their tone of voice is so endearing and it just makes you want to like hug them, but also I don't know how to explain it. Hi, editing Mychala here because I did not properly articulate what I was trying to say. Because of Maya Angelou's bluntness, it added to the integrity of her story because I was shocked and moved and emotionally impacted without the need for extra. Just her saying what happened was enough for me to feel with her and feel that heartbreak with her. That's what I was trying to say. That's the analogy I was trying to make because I feel very similarly when kids do that. That's what I was trying to say. I wasn't trying to make light of her story at all. I just want to let you guys know that. But yeah. Okay, back to the video. She is raw and gets straight to the point. It doesn't feel like she's trying to garner sympathy or hyperbolizing for the sake of a story. And because of her honest, uncut delivery, it makes the moments of her life feel even more impactful as a reader. Sometimes with memoirs or biographies, you can tell if the author has a wall up, but her storytelling ability is so powerful that I was really able to put myself in her shoes. I was able to empathize and feel with her, even though I haven't experienced half of the things that she had to. I don't want to go too deep into all of the things that she went through because, of course, Maya Angelou will tell her story way better than I can, and you should go read it for yourself. Okay, and then I read A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. This is a paranormal horror/thriller that I read with my book club for the month of October. I rated it 3 stars, and I would have rated it higher had it not been for one thing, and I'll get to that in a moment. So, A Head Full of Ghosts follows the lives of the Barretts. They're a normal suburban New England family who are torn apart when 14-year-old Marjorie begins to display signs of acute schizophrenia. After reaching out to counselors and priests to no avail, they agree to be the subjects of a paranormal reality show called The Possession. 15 years after that living nightmare comes to a head, the younger sister Mary gives a best-selling author the tell-all of what really happened in that house of horrors. I hate that word. Also, I should have mentioned this before, but if you see me looking down, it's because I took very extensive notes on all of these books. Let's get the bad out of the way, shall we? Something happens in this book that involves a minor in a highly sexualized situation. Horror and sex have always gone hand in hand in cinema and in books. There's just something about the stark juxtaposition of pleasure and fear that is just effective. And I get that, okay? But Marjorie is 15 years old. She is a minor. She is a child. And in my opinion, there is a scene that was far too graphic for the subject to be underage. That's all I'll say. I don't want to spoil anything if you do choose to read this book, but just be prepared for that. Now the good. There was honestly a lot that I loved about this book. And if it weren't for the aforementioned scene, I probably would have rated this 4 stars. The structure was really unique and engaging. The story is broken into 3 parts. The events as they happened 15 years ago, Mary as she is recounting those events to this best-selling author, and a podcast that breaks down the fictional show that the Barretts were a part of. These parts were pretty expertly interwoven, so I wasn't really sure which source was reliable, and the revelations came at the right time. Next up, I read Immortal Dark by Tigest Girma. Rated this 4.5 stars. There were times when I got a 5-star feeling, but there was just some slight little disconnect that was keeping me from rating it 5 stars, but nonetheless, it was so good. So sorry if the angle changed, my camera overheated. Let's try this again. As I was saying before I was really interrupted, Immortal Dark is a Black vampire dark academia book, and it follows Kadan Adane, the heir to a founding house at Yuxley University, where vampires and humans coexist. When her sister and last living relative vanishes, she infiltrates this society and is forced to reside in the house with the vampire that she thinks is responsible. This was so good. The plot was thick and layered and twisty with quite a few unpredictable turns. All the elements of the plot intertwined in a very satisfying way. And yes, almost every character was morally ambiguous, but somehow they were still so lovable and endearing. Also, Tigist Girma's writing style is beautifully poetic without feeling too wordy. She really knows how to pack an emotional punch without bogging down the pace. The 2 small things that kept me from rating this 5 stars. While I loved the moody, dark, secretive university, I didn't feel fully transported there. I would have enjoyed a few more descriptions, or at least more detailed descriptions of the settings in all of the places that our characters visit. The dark academia and haunted/alive house was so intriguing, and I think just a few more detailed descriptions of the set would have really brought it to life. I don't know, there just wasn't really a point where I could close my eyes and feel like I was there at Yuxley University. And secondly, there was a brief moment where the world building felt a little forced, if that makes sense. There's a lot of lore and history that the reader needs to know, but at times it just felt like the characters were divulging the information because we need to know it. It just didn't always feel natural. But holy smokes, this book was really good, really fun, really entertaining, and I cannot wait to go into Eternal Ruin. Moving on to another 5-star read, I then read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I read and fell in love with Ta-Nehisi's writing a few years back after reading Between the World and Me. Where did it go? It's right above me. You can't see it, but it's right above me, and I love it. Here, Ta-Nehisi dives into how storytelling affects the way history is solidified. Who decides what we accept as truth? How can our stories change the course of history? How can our stories change our perception of history? He ruminates on this idea as he travels throughout Dakar, South Carolina, and Palestine. At each of these locations, he highlights how storytelling, from oral accounts of Palestinians to American news headlines, have shaped the narrative. I listened to this on audiobook, which he narrates, and hearing about his travels through his voice made a really great reading experience. This book really challenged me to look at how history is presented to me through a more critical and empathetic lens, to not take what I hear at face value, to see people for who they are and not just the stories I've heard about them. And most of all, it taught me to listen, because no one can recount a moment in history better than the people who have actually lived it. And lastly, the book that I'm honestly still teetering between 5 and 4.75 stars, Blood Over Bright Haven by Emma Wang. I finished this almost a week ago, but I genuinely have thought about it often, almost every day since, and I'm still sitting with so many feelings and emotions. In case you're unaware, Blood Over Bright Haven follows Skiona. She has worked her entire life to become the first female admitted into the High Magistracy of Tehran. Tehran, I think is how it's pronounced. Tehran is a city literally encompassed by a magical bubble that protects it from brutal winters and the blight. The blight is a mysterious sickness plaguing the people of the outside world. And those people on the outside are called the Quinn. Some of them have made the treacherous and deadly journey to seek refuge inside of Turan's barriers. Skiona receives a mission that could cement her legacy and help her make a name for herself as the first female high mage. She is given a Quinn janitor named Tamil as her assistant. Despite all their differences, they must work together. This story is highly political and extremely relevant. It deals heavily with racism, misogyny, and xenophobia. It is utterly heartbreaking in the best way, I think. I don't think I've ever been pulled into a story the way I was with this one. I sobbed in the first chapter. Before I even had a grasp of the world or the characters or the plot, Wang made me feel so deeply for these strangers that I was reading about. The pacing never slowed down to the point where I was bored. There were times where Wang gave us a moment to catch our breaths, but even then there was something happening that demanded my attention. I really loved that Wang didn't try to veil the political undertones. It was so blatantly obvious that she was commenting on systemic oppression and sexism and racism. You can't read the story without thinking about real life history and current events. The parallels are stark, and I really appreciate that because she didn't allow us to shy away from the mirror that she was holding up to our faces. Another thing I surprisingly enjoyed was getting this story through Skiona's POV. It was equivalent of reading about Jim Crow through the eyes of a white woman. Now hear me out. It doesn't sound right. You know, it doesn't sound like the best way to tell that story. But in this case, it works for one reason. We're seeing systemic oppression through the eyes of an ignorant oppressor, which sadly is what most of us are. Most of us play a role even if we're blind to it. Skiona has her own underlying biases and prejudice. As a result, the epiphanies and conclusions that Skiona comes to, the reader is coming to themselves in real time. That being said, there are a few cons upon reflection that made me drop it down 0.25 stars. Skiona wasn't a perfect hero, and I really actually liked and respected that. But at times, she was so resistant and impervious to Tamil's feedback that I felt like I was banging my head against a wall. She is very stubborn and very stuck in her ways. There were so many instances where she caught herself being selfish or egocentric, but she didn't really change or apologize for it. Now, maybe that was a purposeful decision to show how defiant most people would be when facing the cultural and personal shifts that Skiona was going through. But to me, it kind of felt like her epiphany and character growth happened a little too late, and it was a little too rushed. And then the other reason why I'm not sure if it's 5 stars is because due to the nature of telling the story through Skiona's POV, it can kind of fall into the white savior trope. The marginalized community in this story were not a very big part of their own liberation. Yes, we had Tamil, but he kind of acted as a representative for an entire group of people. I don't know, I would have loved to get a bit more of his perspective. I would have loved to see more inside the Quinn neighborhoods and families and dynamics and their lifestyles. Bring life to the people that were discriminated against and dehumanized. Again, I'm still going back and forth with this one because literally from chapter 1, I had that 5-star feeling. And I do think 5 stars is just as much a feeling as it is a critical analysis. So I don't know, we're going back and forth. Please, if you've read Blood Over Brighthaven, I would love to discuss it in the comments to see where other people kind of stand on the issues that I put forth. Obviously no spoilers, but let's have a discussion. Okay, that was my October reading wrap up. Overall, it was a really, really great month. I hope you guys had a great reading month. I hope your November is off to a great start. You know what, let me put my shirt back on for this outro. A little bit more ladylike. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to subscribe. I make videos here all about books, lifestyle, wellness, and all other creative endeavors. So if that sounds like something you want to be a part of, be sure to subscribe and join our little family. And until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your heart, and I'll see you soon.